This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Hello, my name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre and the University of South Australia. I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. Our presentation tonight, Department Stores, More Than Shopping, is co-presented by the Hawke Centre and the Architecture Museum at the University of South Australia. And I extend a warm welcome to our speakers, Dr Julie Collins, Dr Louise Bird and Dr James Curry. Thank you for joining us tonight. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Dr Julie Collins, Research Fellow and Curator of the Architecture Museum, for all her amazing work in not only bringing tonight's panel session together, but for her time and dedication in curating the exhibition on display in our Carrie Packer Civic Gallery. So congratulations, Julie. I would also like to acknowledge the attendance of Professor Craig Batty, Executive Dean of UniSA Creative. Welcome. As Curator of the Architecture Museum, Dr Julie Collins is responsible for an invaluable research collection of 400,000 items of architectural design documentation, drawings, photographs and artefacts. As well as managing this physical collection, Julie researches and writes biographies, guides to sources and website content, while curating exhibitions and presenting public lectures. Recently, she has written the history of South Australian architects and their work, architectural drawing collections, and on the relationship between buildings and health in her book, The Architecture and Landscape of Health. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Collins. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacinta, and thanks to the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre for hosting what promises to be a fascinating and lively discussion tonight. So welcome everyone. I too would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the land of the Kaurna people and pay our respects. I'm going to start the presentation off with a rather brief wander through some of the buildings designed for South Australian department stores. Then I'll hand over to Louise, who will discuss shopping centres and malls, to be followed by James, who will look at one Adelaide department store in particular. When I talk about the history of buildings, architecture and interiors, I really am talking about our collective social and cultural histories as well. These places are more than simply containers for objects. And as all of you are no doubt aware, buildings play an incredibly important role in our lives as the settings of our interactions and the holders of many of our memories. This is part of the reason why the collections of building plans, photos and archives held by the Architecture Museum here at UniSA and South Australia's other cultural collections like the State Library are so important. Today I'm going to touch on a few points in the history of department stores in South Australia, including how they were buildings which became symbols of their brand, how they utilised advances in technology, how their storefronts functioned, and how they were social spaces as well as retail environments. Before department stores, Adelaide had many shops and warehouses, mostly located on Rundle, Hindley and Grenfell streets. Many of these specialised in a particular type of goods: drapers, chemists, cabinet makers, jewellers, butchers and bakers, to name a few. There were also warehouses used for the storage of goods and wholesale supply, with some also selling retail from showrooms at the front of their premises. Smaller towns often had family-operated businesses in the main streets, like along Norwood Parade and Jetty Road at Glenelg. And for those living further away, hawkers would visit, offering a range of goods for sale from their carts. Shopping arcades became popular in the 19th century. Adelaide Arcade, designed by local architects Withall and Wells in 1885, is an example which still stands in the city today. With 50 shops, the domed arcade of 2 stories had glazed roof lights to provide a bright and airy shopping experience. Stores carrying a wide range of goods were often known then as universal providers, and soon they became known as departmental and then department stores. When they were first introduced in the late 19th century, the opportunity to pick up and examine products which had fixed and ticketed prices was something new. Their offerings ranged from clothing in Manchester to hardware and furniture, perfume and toys. And in 1907, when Foy and Gibson's was opening on the corner of Pulteney and Rundle Streets, the press said the public could look forward to being able to purchase anything from a needle to an elephant. Their business model was based on bulk buying, having large stocks on hand, fixed prices and quick turnover. Yet, as recognised by some of the famous overseas department stores, such as Marshall Field's in Chicago, Selfridges in London and Le Bon Marché in Paris, entertainment, leisure and other services, such as beauty salons, restaurants, galleries, fashion parades and restrooms, all drew customers in. Many of South Australia's department stores began as draperies in the 19th century, with their proprietors, such as John Martin, Charles Moore, Charles Burke and James Marshall, household names already. Other department stores grew from import businesses, such as Craven's, or ironmongers and hardware specialists, such as Harris Scarfs. Department stores drew on several building types in their development: the warehouse, shopping arcade and exhibition building. Essentially, they had large open floor plates punctuated by columns, and it was the work of the professionals we now call interior designers and visual merchandisers to bring them to life and attract customers with their display of products. Structural ironwork became an important technology used in warehouses and department stores. 2-storey facades with full-height glass windows between slender iron columns were an innovation used in Charles Burke's store in Rundle Street, designed by Adelaide architect Daniel Garlick quite early in 1878. Plate glass really came into its own at the end of the 19th century, especially for street front retail show windows. Technologies such as vacuum tubes, flying foxes, escalators and lifts were essential for efficiently moving people, stock and money around the store. Described as a moving stairway, Adelaide's first escalator was installed in 1933 in the Myer Emporium in Rundle Street. Signage with neon letters spelling out business names became a nighttime feature along retail and entertainment streets from the 1930s onwards. Stores such as Ryan's at Glenelg had fluorescent tube signage with large green letters blazing at night over Jetty Road. The provision of good internal lighting and ventilation were presented to shoppers as a reason to visit. Initially through the use of light wells and air shafts, but later with artificial lighting and mechanical ventilation made possible as buildings were electrically wired. Fire control and egress from the building was another concern. Early display window lighting used gas burners, and the risk of fire was high, something discovered in 1901 when John Martin's window caught alight. Yet even with electrical lighting, fire was an ever-present danger, with cafeteria kitchens adding to the risks. Moore's fire of 1948 was devastating, yet the store was rebuilt and amazingly reopened the same year. Department store buildings really were symbols of their brand, appearing not only in advertising, but also, as illustrated here, as floral arrangements. And we can see the floral float for John Martin's from the 1936 Centenary Parade. In 1998, when John Martin's closed, staff were given commemorative Wedgwood plates decorated with a store image from their Rundle Street store. One of the buildings which stood out as a symbol was Foy and Gibson's, and its neighbour, the Grand Central Hotel, both developed by William Gibson and designed by the company's Melbourne architect T.T. Baxter in 1907. Even out of hours, people would visit the city to look at retail windows, and Foy and Gibson's had an enormous length of 325 feet for shop windows on its ground level. Storefront windows were regularly updated and modernised, with stores vying for public attention through their facades. In 1909, the arcade window arrangement was introduced, and these had fully glassed island window displays and recessed bay windows for the window shopper to stand out of the way of footpath traffic. Window dressing and displays were often reported on in the press, with the pleasure of window shopping described in the following manner in 1928, and I quote, "There is a charm about bargain hunting when the goods are displayed for your attention, and something of the glamour of an Eastern bazaar about a walk round the windows of a firm like Charles Burke Limited, who have gained a reputation for their artistic work in this direction," end quote. Department store buildings were regularly decorated for events and for the festive season. Charles Burke's was covered in garlands, flowers and artwork for the state centenary celebrations in 1936, while John Martin's was decorated with flags and a giant VE for Victory in Europe Day in 1945. And the Queen's coronation in 1953 was celebrated with window displays too. Within the stores, displays were designed to attract attention as well as allow the customer to examine the products on offer. Yet records of these displays are hard to come by, and this photograph of a stationery display in Moores is one of the few I have found. Myers' perfume bar of 1937 was designed like a cocktail bar, with a martini glass motif and mirrors. At it, one could sample a range of perfumes and have a file filled and later refilled with the perfume of one's choice. One of the benefits of using architectural drawings as a research resource is the detail they contain about a building's intended use. This section through Cox Foy's of the 1960s shows how department stores offered more than just shopping. Toilets, ladies' lounges and powder rooms, writing desks and telephones were expected. And here, hairdressers, pharmacies and travel agents were added to the offerings. The ladies' lounge and powder room was an important attractor, especially for those with children to care for. Staffed by an attendant, here we can see the baby room, powder room, telephones, writing desks, as well as toilets and a shower available in store. But perhaps more well known at Cox Foy's was its rooftop fun fair, with a Ferris wheel, merry-go-round, flying pigs, as well as swings and slippery dips. More recently, the Myer Centre's Dazzle Land featured a roller coaster and entertainment tenancies at the top of its atrium. Cafes, restaurants, butteries, food halls and event spaces offered the public places not only to eat but to socialise. In 1930s, Myers Cafeteria reportedly catered for 24,000 customers per week, with a menu that included roast pork and applesauce, kippered snacks, prunes and junket, banana jelly, and soft drinks, tea, coffee and cocoa. Galleries, exhibitions, theatres, demonstrations, and lecture rooms for hire were available at most department stores in the mid-20th century, and John Martin's Ballroom was the venue for the Architects' Ball, held by the South Australian Institute of Architects for its members in 1939. In 1936, Myers offered patrons a lending library from which they could borrow books and also sit and read the latest releases. Well into the 20th century, department stores hosted toy exhibitions, floral displays and photographic shows open to the public, not to mention magic caves and Christmas pageants. So the social spaces and activities which department stores provided offered the public reasons for being in store which were not directly connected to purchasing goods, but which very often enticed them past products and staff stationed to enable purchasing. It also built goodwill. Brand loyalty translated across the state, with city department stores such as Harris Scarfs opening suburban and country branches as well. The main streets of country towns became a sought-after location for these branches, such as this Harris Scarfs branch at Whyalla from 1941. And in the suburbs, regional shopping malls, such as we can see here at West Lakes Mall in the western suburbs of Adelaide, were designed. This was designed in 1973 to incorporate John Martin's department store as its anchor tenant. These malls enabled air conditioning shopping and convenient car parking. And the city centre had to respond. Rundle Street became pedestrianised in 1976 and Rundle Mall was born. At the same time, Foy and Gibson's building on the corner of Rundle and Pulteney Streets was demolished and a large multi-storey car park erected on the site. The impact of shopping malls on the retail environment in South Australia will be explored much more in detail by our next speaker, Louise Bird, who I'll now invite to the lectern. Louise Bird is a historian who specialises in the history of architecture, design landscapes and urban planning. She began her career in the conservation of cultural materials before moving into historical studies and completing a research master's in landscape architecture and a PhD focusing on the history of open space planning in metropolitan Adelaide. In 2018, Dr Bird wrote Neighbourhood Shops, Park and Shop Centres in Metropolitan Adelaide, one of our monograph series. Dr Bird works as Senior Heritage Assessment Officer for Heritage South Australia, while also pursuing academic research interests as an Adjunct Research Fellow at UniSA Creative. Could you join me in welcoming Louise?
Good evening, everyone. So, why has the shopping centre, with its ubiquitous form of a central shopping area surrounded by acres of hard surfacing, come to dominate our urban form? In large part, it is because of the invention of the automobile, and rightly or wrongly in the 20th century, the idea that everyone will have a car and drive it wherever they need or want to go. It is also tied to rapid post-war growth and the rapid expansion of Adelaide in the decades after the Second World War, following the latest trends in town planning ideas, particularly the neighbourhood unit and new town ideas, but incorporating new ways to shop devised in the USA specifically to suit the personal use of the car. While this presentation focuses on metropolitan Adelaide, there are many parallels with experiences in South Australia's larger regional centres too. Shopping has been a part of South Australian life since the earliest days of the colony. Food and a variety of other household and personal goods were offered for sale either directly from the importer or could be purchased from specialised shops or general stores. As Julie mentioned, shopping in Adelaide became concentrated along Rundle, Curry, Hindley and Grenfell streets, while in the small settlements in what became Adelaide's suburbs and rural towns, a variety of shops operated as family businesses selling different food products and household goods. However, large purchases were the domain of the city stores, with the department store turning shopping into a luxury and leisure experience, as much as fulfilling household and personal requirements. And James will discuss this aspect further shortly. In the suburbs, shops tended to be consolidated around activity and transport nodes. Think of the shopping strips along Unley Road, the Parade and Jetty Road in Glenelg. A common element of all of the shops, whether located in the city or suburbs, was their unplanned nature. That is, each shop was opened in a location where the owner believed they could attract the most customers and thereby run a successful business. Consequently, shops lined the main streets in ribbons or clusters without considering the impact they had on the urban environment. Perhaps not much of an issue with smaller populations and no trucks or cars. However, as motor vehicles came to dominate our roads, concerns emerged about traffic congestion, pedestrian safety, the negative impact on living areas and aesthetic considerations, the whole mess being considered to be rather unsightly and unsafe. Enter the shopping centre. While drawn from the drive-in markets that were built in Los Angeles in the 1920s, Park and Shop, built in Washington DC in 1930, is recognised as the first shopping centre designed specifically as a response to the increasing use of cars and quickly became a model for the range of shopping centres that were subsequently built. The park and shop model introduced the idea that in the one building there would be a variety of individual stores, each operated by a different trader, with at least one store acting as the anchor. That is a primary shop that attracts customers to the shopping centre, who then in turn would also shop at all the other stores. Importantly, once the shopper had reached the shops from the car park, the shopping experience was fully removed from vehicles, making a safe pedestrian environment to shop in. All deliveries for the shops were also kept separate to customer parking, further improving safety and the amenity of the shopping experience. Park and Shop was a small shopping centre that aimed to provide for daily shopping needs, but from it was born the shopping mall. The rise of the shopping mall in the years following World War II altered not only the way people shopped, but also the urban form. Vast tracts of undeveloped land in the suburbs were turned into these large and sometimes enormous shopping centres that were surrounded by acres of car parking. Like the city centres that they challenged, these new shopping towns were viewed as more than simply places to shop. In 1960, North American architect Victor Gruen and economist Larry Smith, who were leaders in the planning and design of shopping malls, described them as a grouping of buildings and related spaces that established a new environment in 20th century life, not only for shopping, but for many other activities as well. The shopping centre, or shopping town as it was known, was envisaged as a crystallisation point for community life that was the modern equivalent to the Greek agora, medieval marketplace, and town square. The shopping centre or mall was considered to be a place where civic, social, cultural and educational needs could be met. Importantly, and unlike the city centre, the shopping centre was an exclusively pedestrian environment, initially as a combination of external and internal spaces and later as fully enclosed and air-conditioned sites. While South Australia introduced town planning in the first decades of the 20th century, and the garden suburb Cunnamulla Gardens was lauded as an exemplary town planning model, it was not until after World War II that town planning increasingly guided the development of Adelaide's urban form. It was also in the decades after the war that the impact of growing private ownership of cars highlighted the need for planned shopping centres. In South Australia, we adopted planning models based on the Garden City, but mediated by North American ideas about the neighbourhood unit and the melding of those ideas into the British New Town planning model. In South Australia, those ideas were adopted early by the South Australian Housing Trust and were implemented at Elizabeth in the 1950s and 60s, and there are other developments such as at Noarlunga and in regional South Australia. Like Cunnamulla Gardens, Elizabeth also became a model and was promoted by the Town Planning Committee, which was established in 1955 and led by government town planner Stuart Hart. The work of the committee meant that not only government agency developers such as the Housing Trust and later the SA Land Commission, but also private developers like Realty Development Corporation, Alum Hickenbotham Proprietary Limited and Delphin would develop large tracts of the metropolitan area following these planning principles too. In 1962, the Town Planning Committee published the report on the metropolitan area of Adelaide, the master plan that guided the growth of the city between 1962 and 1990, and within it was detailed advice about all aspects of the city's future shopping needs. By the time the report was published, there was already pronounced parking problems in Adelaide CBD and at Port Adelaide and Glenelg. The Town Planning Committee was also concerned about the impact that cars had on residential quality. To address the emerging issues of vehicle use on shopping in residential areas, the committee proposed a hierarchy of shopping centres, following not only the preferred planning models, but also the park and shop model too. Basically, the committee divided the metro area into a series of districts which supported their objectives of decentralisation and the coordinated growth and development of the metropolitan area. Each district was to be largely self-contained and possess its own district centre and industrial area that would serve a population of between 80,000 and 150,000 people. The committee's hierarchy of shopping centres are up here on the slide, but what are they? The central shopping area is the Adelaide CBD, not just Rundle Street, but the other shopping opportunities then found in the city, including large department and furniture stores, clothing, and those amongst others selling high-end goods. This level of the hierarchy served shopping needs of the entire metropolitan area and more broadly the state. The next layer was the major suburban or district centres. These are the malls we have today. Think Marion, Elizabeth, Colonnades at Noarlunga, Tea Tree Plaza, West Lakes and even Arndale. It was envisaged that these malls would contain more than 120 shops and have at least one department store as an anchor, with a newly emerging supermarket quickly assuming the place as the second anchor. And yes, there is a reason why the supermarket and the department store are located at opposite ends of the mall. It's so you have to walk between the two, stopping to shop at all the little stores on the way in between. The Arndale Shopping Centre, located in Kilkenny, was an important early example of a major suburban centre, as it was South Australia's first fully enclosed and air-conditioned mall, and you can find out more about that in the exhibition. Where these district shopping centres have been included as more of a component of a master planned community, forming a part of a planned regional or district centre, other services and amenities are also provided. For example, the Colonnade Shopping Centre was planned as a part of the Noarlunga Regional Centre, and Elizabeth Shopping Centre forms a part of the Elizabeth Town Centre. At Noarlunga, there is also the Council Chambers, TAFE, Public Library, Theatre, Public Transport Hub, hospital, medical facilities and other such things. Elizabeth is quite similar too. Secondary suburban centres are a smaller version of the major centres and often included the already existing shopping areas such as Semaphore Road, Unley Road and Parade. An example of a purpose-built secondary centre is the shopping centre at Ingle Farm, with its supermarket and junior department stores, the variety stores Best and Less and Kmart acting as anchors. The secondary suburban centre provided for the shopping needs of more than the suburb, but not necessarily the whole district. Minor shopping centres, also called neighbourhood shopping centres, were included as a component of neighbourhood unit design and were often an integral element of the neighbourhood centre. Typical features of the neighbourhood centre are the shopping centre, a primary school, kindergarten, open space and community facilities. Neighbourhood shopping centres were intended to serve the immediate needs of the people living in the neighbourhood unit or the suburb. Things like grocery, but also maybe the hairdresser, post office, they were once that common, hardware and children's clothing. Consequently, this form of shopping centre proliferated, along with the suburbs in which they were built. Ideal siting between neighbourhood shopping centres was approximately 1.6 kilometres, making them not more than 800 metres from homes. This was intended so that mum, with little children in a pram, could walk to the shops. Although they are also car-friendly, as most followed the park and shop model. With changes in shopping patterns today, these are the shopping centres that are struggling the most to remain viable. Local centres were also a component of neighbourhood design and contained only a few shops selling convenience goods. Some were built in addition to the suburban or neighbourhood shopping centre. These guys were ideally within 400 metres of the homes that they were aimed to serve, and they were meant to be walked to. And they were only built in suburbs where they were either very large or irregularly shaped, meaning that pedestrian distances would be increased. In our last few minutes, I just thought it important to note that many of our shopping centres were originally open-air centres, comprised of either one or a small cluster of physically and architecturally related buildings with landscape pedestrian areas and gardens. Most have now either been superseded or redesigned and built in to provide an enclosed air conditioning or all-weather shopping experience. Many of our shopping centres were also intended as community spaces, especially those that form a part of regional or district centres and the dozens that were built in our neighbourhood centres. As such, they provide opportunities for different and lower frequency use businesses and community programs in ready-made facilities served by ample car parking and frequently public transport. Many remain an untapped resource for the future. And I just want to acknowledge the Department for Environment and Water and Heritage South Australia in particular and their Built Heritage Research Fellowship, which is where the research for this presentation has come tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. That was really interesting presentation. I'm going to invite Dr James Curry to the podium now. Dr Curry is a lecturer in interior architecture at the University of South Australia and the director of the Architecture Museum. He has previously worked in internationally recognised architecture offices of Will Arets in the Netherlands and Kishio Kurokawa in Japan, and held teaching positions at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology and the University of Adelaide. As a researcher, Dr Curry has published and exhibited on the architecture of Rudolf Schindler, Australian architecture and contemporary art practices. And I might just add that his exhibition, Modern Beach Houses, is on during May 2023 at the Odessa Gallery in Lee Street in the city. Would you welcome Dr Curry?
I've been asked to put some thoughts together about shopping centres and department stores, and I just thought that it's a little bit disconnected, but here we go. Australians are often disconcerted at the suggestion that a department store could have a history. There are several obvious reasons for that: short-term employment patterns, employee and even managerial indifference to the workplace, ideologies about what counts as proper history, and the commitment of the department store to its own newness, which leaves often a history of the department store off the page. I'm interested in connecting broader set of ideas to a broader network. In connecting the ideas to a broader set of ideas, you have a different change of horizon in which to look at the work. In this sense of horizon, it shifts beyond individual agency of authors and their designed objects. In architectural history in Australia, everything has been focused on individuals and their buildings. And this has been some kind of Renaissance idea about the idea of authorship of the projects. In recent historiography in architecture, particularly since the late 90s, people like Beatrice Colomina and Keller Esterling have shifted the understandings about how to do architectural history in looking at infrastructures, media, and shifting the approach in the ways that we understand the individual agency of the objects. In 1954, Charles Burke's was acquired by David Jones in Rundle Street. Between 1960 and 62, a new Charles Burke store, later David Jones store, was constructed on the existing premises in stages to ensure minimum interruptions. Prior to the construction of that store, Jack McConnell, architect, who was a partner at Hassell, McConnell and Partners, the store architect, had visited the United States on study tours in the years 1947, 1949, 1952, and 1961. In 1947, Foley's department store in Houston was constructed. The store was among the first large-scale post-war construction projects in America and the first entirely new department store that was ever made. The construction of the store was carried out and in periodicals such as Life magazine, Progressive Architecture, and The New Yorker. The project itself had national interest. Designed by Kenneth Fransheim, an exponent of modernism, the interiors were designed by Raymond Loewy. Loewy believed that by maximising the mechanisation within the store, it would cut costs, and he went about by decluttering the store. The most abrupt departure from the department store was its total lack of windows above the first floor, although massive plate glass show windows ringed the store at ground level. The store's exterior was faced in buff-coloured Minnesota stone and matched brick. The lack of windows above the first floor kept out the harsh Houston light, and it also contributed significantly to heating and cooling efficiency. The sales department was organised to fan out from the escalators towards the perimeter of the building with related merchandise grouped in local arrangements. Columns were spaced out, which provided easy access for the sales departments, and in many instances, the wide spacing of the columns meant that entire departments were unbroken. Every aspect of the floor plans aimed to maximise efficiency and the flow of goods and the flow of consumers, and whilst plying customers of their hard-earned money. And this may seem terribly like an echo of what we've got here, but the stock store on each floor was surrounded on the perimeter of each floor. Here's a flow diagram that was well publicised, which shows the flow of stock through the department store. And here you can see the decluttering of the department store with Raymond Loewy, and you can see, and it was done through a series of modules that could be moved around. You can also see in this sketch the perimeter walls where stock was hidden behind. Okay, so now we get here. At Charles Burke's, we see an echo. We see an echo of this earlier moment. A windowless facade of Italian marble recedes within the context, with air conditioning making the windowless, sealed, interiorized store an artificial environment which felt natural and comfortable. While windows on the earlier store grounded the individual, within the city, presenting its cityscape, the windowless facade permitted more interior space and allowed the interior to be otherworldly, which also sustained by the absence of means of telling the time and through the exclusion of all natural light and any element of the external environment. Shoppers, in short, could be entranced as they walked through the panoply of consumer splendours. The idea of progress, which was a key idea at the time within all these departments. Sorry, I should say that Charles Burke's was kind of part of an expansion of David Jones, and it was a series of other shops, but it was the first dedicated store to David Jones. And it was constructed in stages, and here's some sketches from Merv Smith of the construction. Here's the windowless facade with no windows. I've always appreciated this building because of the way it recedes into its context, and we were just discussing before how it's very different to more recent additions to North Terrace, which sell jewellery, which advance vulgarly in a monstrous way. So I've always appreciated that. Yeah, so here you can see, and you can see here also one of the interests at the time that was reported, the transparency in the escalators to allow for easy panoramic views through and it got to guide shoppers to the merchandise. On the floor plan, you can see surrounding the perimeter, the storage areas, which allowed for easy access to merchandise for the keepers. One way this American model gets twisted though, is the way, because David Jones and Charles Burke's was aiming to appeal to the upper middle class, is the way it gets twisted. And it gets twisted by the ideas of service styling and ennobling the customer. Because if you're a gentleman or a lady, you need help finding the right thing. A significant part of the department store's merchandise solution was the presentation. The salesperson was part of that presentation, helping to create an atmosphere of service and contributing to the seductiveness of the merchandise. The scale of the store, its legion of employees, created the possibility of a profusion of goods and transforming the meaning of those goods when you were purchasing them. What emerged within this department store is there was a choice to either be anonymous and browse, or if you're a respectable individual, you would need help and in finding the right thing in order to distinguish yourself. As you can see, one of the mottos for the salespeople was diligent care. And there was, the teams were broken up into staff which would help with the sales of the product and staff to help with the finding of what you needed. So with David Jones, not only was there service styling, but there was also added offerings, and this added the idea of luxury to the store. By providing help with what you needed, there were other staff that assisted you, and in so doing, you chose a lifestyle that was appropriate to your level of status. So these added offerings are now listed behind me, and you can see some of them here: the Mayfair room, the Pioneer room, the Coolabah Tree room, the coffee shop, the Bond Street beauty salon, David Jones locker, men's and women's hairdresser, as well as they had a gallery. And the gallery had an important part in Adelaide's life because it inscribed itself quite naturally that if you were a distinguished person, that you would be invited to something like this. So it gave the store itself a preeminent status by having it there. And you can see here they held in 1968, I think it was, the architects' dinner up in the restaurant with Harry Seidler as the guest speaker. Over the last 10 years, there's been a nostalgia boom, the retro, the vintage, all sorts of kinds of ways of reimagining the past, and the media has kind of played along with this. It's very easy to share that. Since the 1980s, David Jones's stores across Australia were kind of proliferated, and they weakened the brand and levelled it. In order to reinscribe luxury, David Jones in the last few years has begun to close some of the stores, and they've returned to their archive in order to reinscribe luxury within its environment. Rather than exploit this material, there is a potential here to think about not simply the manipulating of customers or treating nostalgia as a symptom that explains something, but as a positive force that can do something. Such a nostalgia for the past could be that we reimagine these environments in new ways which transform the past that never occurred. Thank you.
Thanks, James. That was a really wonderful talk with some incredible images as well. So what we're going to do now is answer some of the questions which some of you sent in for us. And there's quite a range of them. And I'm going to start with one for Louise, which has come in. And it says, what impact did the emergence of the suburban department stores and malls have on our downtown retail?
So quite interestingly, the Town Planning Committee, when they were preparing their report in 1962, had already identified that the decline of urban centres, particularly in the large US cities due to the suburban shopping centres, was a major issue. However, they thought that because the City of Adelaide was readily accessible within a well-planned road system with public transport, and even though it had congestion and parking problems, they were still only relatively minor, that it would be more likely to be the regional shopping centres if they tended towards that enormous size rather than the large size that we tend to have, although Marion might be considered to be enormous, and that they would actually have the issues remaining economically viable. Within less than 10 years, it's pretty obvious that that's not the case. And that's when you start having the thinking and the revisualisation of Rundle Street as a pedestrianised mall. And obviously they started some planning and working there, and the whole mall as a pedestrianised space was opened on the 1st of September in 1976 by the Premier Don Dunstan as a means to actually combat what was going on by taking all the people out into suburbia.
Well, that's quite interesting, and I think it really actually leads on one of our other questions, which I'll just ask you. Did that mean that the department store meant that it was the demise of the local general store?
So going back to that kind of earlier period, if you think about where the department stores were born, so for some, obviously, yes, some of those general stores didn't make it. But when you think about Johnny's, who was a draper originally in the 19th century, and Harris Scarfs, who started as an ironmonger, they learned to adapt and redefine themselves and grow, and they became our department stores. So for them, it was an entirely different scenario.
I think that's something I found when I was doing the exhibition as well, how many of them came from those kind of drapery roots. So they were selling clothing and fabric and Manchester and those types of things. But as you mentioned, they expanded into ironmongery and furniture and all those kinds of things, whereas other brands like Harris Scarfs, who had started as the ironmongers and the hardware, they expanded the other way and began to bring in kind of drapery and those types of goods as well. So I think one of the things about department stores is that they were departments, as we've kind of noticed through the name of them, and it was about how they arranged these variable types of products in one store. And I think this is probably something you've noticed in some of the planning, is how they actually grouped departments together. I don't know whether you've got some comments on that.
Well, it allowed for a panorama and the smoothness, but at the same time, as we know, on David Jones, there's a sculpture at the front, the progress sculpture. which allowed for the idea of freedom. So the free plan allowed for freedom, but it came with the constraint of being anonymous as an individual, whereas in the earlier department stores, there was a kind of one-to-one relationship and it was less anonymous. But when it became much more mechanised, you became mass shopping. The individual became, quite anonymous, and but also you allowed for greater access and freedom to it.
Yeah, I think, and I think that American model is interesting how that kind of came in as well. And one of the questions from the audience is around the impact of the overseas. And the question reads, what role do you see that department stores played in Australia's changing cultural landscape and exposure to products from other countries?
That's a big question, and I think we need to, particularly this piece of, it was an American model, arrived in Adelaide after World War II. Previously, you can imagine how insular, inward-looking Adelaide was at that time, and then for something like that to arrive, but also the politics of that, where previously Australia there was Pax Britannica, now we have Pax Americana after World War II. So there's a kind of a sudden pivot in the way things were being done. But also DJs, it stocked some of the bits from England and bits from America. So it was putting together a kind of a whole emporium of different from different cultures. But I think it needs to be understood in terms of this pivot away from Britain to America.
So they were stocking some of those international brands that we kind of are familiar with today, but this was possibly when they were starting to be introduced.
Yes, my understanding with David Jones is that most of the stock was not local. It was from Sydney or international, again trying to separate itself from the other department stores. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting in terms of, as we were mentioning, the way that these stores started. There's a couple of questions here about two local Adelaide businesses, and one of the questions which came in from one of you was about Miller Anderson's and asking for any information about that. And this is one of the stores which I quite enjoyed digging a little bit into the history of. And Miller Anderson's was probably the longest surviving department store in Adelaide, and it had begun as Miller and Gale Drapers on Hindley Street in 1840. It became a department store by expanding its offerings to include household goods and furniture and sporting goods as well, and became a series of buildings along that Hindley Street area, which not only had the shop, but interestingly, and in common with some of the other department stores, it had workrooms for tailoring staff. I think some of you might remember one of the identifying features about the building was its logo, and this echoes back to how James was talking about the idea of a motif and buildings on buildings. And they had what was called the sign of the lamb, which was a golden lamb with a blue ribbon tied around it, and they used that as their motif, which was not only on a sign out the front of the building, but used in terms of the store branding. I think the other thing which I find interesting, which harks back to that international aspect, was that one of its directors, Mr. Henry Anderson, was actually an architect, and he'd studied architecture in London and was a member of the RIBA and designed its 1922 building, which still stands on Hindley Street, and we kind of now know, I think it's disposed of as apartments. So Miller Anderson's was really one of those long-running Adelaide institutions. It finally closed in 1988, but it had a brief reprieve for a while as a half of the Myers store when the Myers Centre was being built, and half of it was temporarily located in the Miller Anderson building, and the other half was down where Target is now. So that was quite an interesting a local brand, which even though it was sold to some Sydney owners kind of in that mid-20th century, it remained something which is really embedded in a lot of South Australians' minds. The other shop which I did get a question about here was FC Katz, and that was another drapery which stayed as a drapery, so it didn't expand out to become a department store, and that's on the site where the Edmonds building is in Rundle Mall now. One of the other questions, which I think Louise might be able to tackle, is comes from someone, and they say stores are really for people to buy stuff. So the people need to get there. How much consideration is there in the design for different transport modes to the stores to maximise people? How much of it is just narrow thinking for cars, 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 which are ugly and inefficient designs and uses of space?
Well, certainly the shopping centres were all about cars, cars, cars. That's probably a bit glib. Whilst they were designed with the idea that you could drive there if you wanted to, when you start looking about where they're actually located within the metropolitan area, those large regional stores, they're actually on major thoroughfares. And then when you also think about the little neighbourhood unit ones, they're actually centred in the middle of the neighbourhood unit, but again on the main roads that would take you in and out of the neighbourhood unit, with the other secondary roads branching off of that. So that then immediately opens them up to being on the bus routes in particular. But places like Elizabeth and Noarlunga, they're actually designed also as public transport hubs. So you have the trains going there, and then you can relocate to the bus and then actually go back out to the suburbs in that way. So there is thinking about public transport when those places are being designed, whether or not all of the public transport routes then eventuate or remain at a frequency that makes them quite easy for lots of people to use is an entirely different matter. Mm.
And I think this is something which then that kind of city-suburb struggle between them kind of came about. And I don't know whether, I think behind David Jones there ended up being a parking station. Is that correct?
That's right. That happened later. It almost follows to the T, the Foley's model, where in the basement you would have goods that could go into the car park later on. It has chutes, it has all the markings, all the traits of that earlier moment.
Well, I think that's the other thing. It's deliveries. Home deliveries was quite a common thing as well. Before we all owned cars and could drive and park at our, convenience. Quite often Harris Scarfs, John Martins, David Jones had the delivery vans, so you could shop in store and request that they would be delivered as well. I think James, I've got a question that might be able to be answered by you. And this comes from an audience member who says, how strong is the correlation between the fashion of the time and the luxury lifestyle or architectural trends of an era?
That's a good question. For a while I was digging around on the houndstooth logo pattern. It was... For instance, in 1956-57, Dior actually copyrighted the houndstooth pattern. But in 1962, the same year as the department store, David Jones actually made that its official kind of pattern. So I was interested in the migration of that. And in fact, in the basement of David Jones, the terrazzo is still there. It's in a houndstooth pattern. So the migration of that pattern or the branding is interesting.
Yeah. So, architecture really is a bit of a fashion industry, would you say?
Yeah, the now. Yeah.
And I think in a strange way, this kind of leads in terms of contrast onto our next question, which says, are our big department stores being active in lessening wastage of goods? We hear so much excess stuff going into landfill, especially garments. Is there a better way? This is probably a little bit of a big question to Peter.
In my travels at this short little exercise that Julie set me, I was ringing around, and the David Jones expert said, Marion will this year clock over $1 billion worth of turnover, $1 billion of stuff. And I was shocked because I thought, we talk about sustainability, but we don't talk about that $1 billion of stuff that's going through it, and, the impact of that. Yeah. So I thought there was a kind of poverty of thought within, particularly in architecture and thinking through ideas of consumerism.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. And I think it's interesting because what we're not kind of saying overtly here, but which is really probably a fact, is a fact, shops are places for the consumption of goods, which no doubt leads us to the potential for many of us to overconsume or purchase items which we don't need or probably don't even want, and many may end up in landfill. And I think the elephant in the room, I wonder if it was got at Foy and Gibson's, the elephant in the room is online shopping versus in-store shopping, and the difference that it might make to our habits if we can pick up and browse and consider the goods, consider how we're going to carry them home, if we're going to carry them home. Not to mention that consciousness when you're in a space, being in a social space, making purchases. You know, if we're, going ballistic on our phone, clicking as we go, would we be doing the same thing if we were in a department store having to carry all of this with us? I think the other concern in terms of waste for the architectural and interior industry really is building and construction waste, and the importance of being conscious of this and the opportunities that maybe with a little imagination for reuse, these department store buildings, if they're not going to be continued to be used for that function, they're large, unimpeded floor plates. Could we reimagine them in a different way?
The same too for all of those smaller kind of shopping centres as well, because you don't have to commit to a really large floor space. They are discrete shops. I mean, the example I showed on the slide, which was for Elizabeth West, they're actually kind of modular units, and the Pom-Pom has actually joined 3 or 4 of those modular units together to provide them with the amount of space they need to actually run their outreach program. But that could be converted back to, 3 or 4 separate shops if needs be. So there's lots of different options for different less frequency use kind of businesses to start reutilising those spaces too.
Yeah, I think, the fact that they are empty and adaptable, and they're generally in high use, fantastically located places, which they were designed to be in those places to attract consumers, and maybe instead of consuming goods, maybe they could be used for consuming experiences.
Yes.
And that kind of thing. So yeah, and I think Pom-Pom's quite a good example. Got a bit of a funny one here. Did any of your mothers, let alone you, I guess, use lay-by to purchase store items for the family?
So I'm going to say thank you to whoever asked that question for thinking that we actually all might be that young. In our conversation about this question, it turns out that we all have used lay-by in our lives ourselves. But if you want to know about going back to my own mother's experience, no, she didn't, because she saved up before she bought anything, and that was the way it was for many, many years, and it was probably more of that shift in the 80s and 90s when access to credit cards and became more available, that she might then buy things on a credit card, but still always the knowledge that there was money in the bank to pay off that purchase.
Just looking around our audience, we might have to also give a bit of a definition of lay-by.
All right. Very well then. So the lay-by system is where you can select the goods you wish to buy, and then you take them to the store attendant and they will write them up, and then you have a payment system that was usually about 6 or 8 weeks in duration. You'd have to pay a deposit, and key here is you actually left the goods in the store, and you had to go back every week or every fortnight and make a payment and pay it off within that set period of time, and then you're allowed to have your goods to take home. So there's not the instant gratification, but in the days where we didn't have quite as much mass consumerism, it meant that those goods were now yours. They were safe. They were put away for you when you'd finished paying off that lay-by term.
I think it's interesting as well, because I know in the Cox Foy's drawing, as I was looking at them, there was the lay-by counter with the stock area behind it for keeping the stock. And I do remember, I think it was the lay-by department at Target, and you could kind of see behind the counter, there was huge pigeonholes with everybody's wrapped kind of, purchases, just tantalising. But making it, bring in every week up when you got your pay, in cash probably.
In cash.
Bring it in.
You go in and pay it off, yeah.
Pay it off.
I guess the one thing that does still remain that's quite close to that are the toy sales that the big department stores and places like Target still have annually, and you can start purchasing the Christmas presents in the middle of the year and then pay them off slowly for Christmas time at the end of the year.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and even though there's not a question here, I'm just going to say, hey, toys, Christmas, magic caves, pageants, I think some of those things are so associated, well, especially in Adelaide with our Christmas pageant, are so embedded in our culture, that festive season, and almost, dare I say it, the spending season. And at David Jones, I seem to remember they used to have, I think it was the girls' choir singing there. And I don't know if any of you have memories of kind of that Christmas festive season in department stores. How about you, James?
I do remember the Magic Cave, yes, and the lay-buying, yes, I do remember all that. I guess one thing about David Jones is that the story goes that, yes, it became a frictionless environment, but there were people that were operating the devices, the machines, and I do think there's an alternative history, which is one where we drill down on who these people were and the stories that, because I'm sure there was friction in these environments. And there's two people that I think that come to mind with David Jones is Ross and Nina Luck, who were very significant figures and friends of the Benathans and did things with their money that, in a very interesting way. So I think there's a whole other narrative around David Jones that hasn't been talked about yet.
Yep. I guess if I can just add with regards to the Magic Cave too, is the idea that these department stores, or John Martin's in particular, were providing intergenerational experiences. So you could go ride Nipper and Nimble, and then later on in life you take your own children to go and ride Nipper and Nimble, and then they could take their children. And I think the loss of those kinds of experiences is something that's detrimental to us all.
That's right, and I think that kind of what James was saying about the people, I mean, it wasn't just the sales assistants, they really were kind of front of house staff, but the myriad of people who were behind there, the illustrators who would do incredible illustrations for the newspapers every morning when they came out, the store detectives who I'm sure were lurking there, the wonderful, wonderful lift ladies who everybody remembers the lift ladies, and I would love to just say going up, but there are many people who were working behind the scenes, and I think in the coffee shops, the restaurants, the cafeterias, and then the delivery drivers, and I think this is probably one of the reasons we've got so much interest in this, is that so many people had their first, after school job, university days job, working in a sales department in a department store, quite often selling, men's shoes or furniture and things they really didn't know anything about, but they soon learnt. But I think those people behind the scenes were really something, and that art of service, which is one of the questions we did get, which was about the lost art of service. I hope it's not lost. Is there any hope for the department store to continue if they don't offer the extras, e.g., I like the way they've done this, e.g. luxury, architecture and toilets?
As a mother with children, toilets that are really lovely are all important.
Very much.
They really are, and a place that you can take the small children when they're having an absolute total meltdown. And it's also part of that kind of escaping leisure experience. So, you can get out. You're not trapped and contained at home. It is somewhere that is all weather, and the kids can actually have a bit of a wander and a look around too. And I know I used shopping centre in particular when my kids were very young as just an escape to get out of the house. So yes, those kinds of things are critical. Yep. You need those facilities there.
And I think interestingly, toilets in that kind of early 20th century, department store toilets were some of the few ladies' restrooms which were actually publicly available in the city. Before that, I guess you just had to go home. So having facilities like that available, quite often, I think in Foy and Gibson's, they were toilets, but they were called writing rooms as well, because they had the I guess you were writing your shopping list rather than, letters home. But they had writing rooms and places where you could powder your nose, and the powder room. And I don't know if any of you remember the rather extensive ladies' lounges, which had, banquettes of seating as well as mirrors with, lovely lighting around them. Quite close to, there'd be a hairdresser and a beauty salon and things like that as well. But it was, somewhere which was a bit luxurious and really added to it. So, James, what about you? In your look at this luxury brand, what do you feel about the lost art of service?
Well, I mean, as I was trying to say a little bit with that nostalgia and the rise of the nostalgia, maybe it could be reimagined in a way that it never was, and particularly with the new media, maybe this idea of using your phone or be incorporated within the department store in a way that would allow for a new kind of service to emerge based on something that never happened. Yeah,
I think that service and the experience is probably one of the things that has more recently been lost. And I think just, going through looking at the buildings and what the buildings were designed to incorporate, the experience of shopping wasn't just about the purchase. It was about having experience, meeting friends. I found a wonderful newspaper article from I think it was about the 1920s or 30s, where a woman was talking about, I've had a really successful day. I've been shopping for 4 hours and haven't bought anything. And I think our last question tonight, which has come from the audience, is can department stores be rejuvenated? And I'll lead off with that. I think there's potential, and this is what curating this exhibition and writing the book has showed me. There's potential for us to really reconsider the model which department stores are based. And as James said, I think in looking back, possibly we can rediscover some of the ways which they were those experiential spaces, not about the consumption of goods, but about those social and cultural connections and about purchasing from another human being rather than from your phone. I think it's interesting that in speaking to the numerous people I have about this exhibition, everybody's mentioned their memories being going into the buildings and visiting the Buttery restaurant or the Magic Cave or the floral or Lego displays, listening to the piano player or choirs. They haven't been about, I remember buying this particular pen at the counter. So they remember the experiences, but they also remember the brand and they remember which store it was they had those experiences in. So I think in terms of department stores going into the future, there is rejuvenation.
I mean, I was really curious to hear about David Jones having an archive and then that they were actually digitising some of this and they were going to, and they would kind of repackage this or bring it back in a way, in a new way. And I think this is really interesting in terms of, the department stores and the idea of nostalgia.
Less splintering too. The idea of the department store was to provide a whole range of things in the one place. We now seem to have a lot of individual shops residing within our department stores. The whole point of going there was so that if you wanted to buy a brand new winter coat, all the winter coats were together and you could compare and work out which one you wanted. Now you've got to walk all around the place. So this idea of looking back to see how we might be able to go forward is actually a really good one, and I actually look forward to seeing what David Jones comes up with in the future.
Yep.
Well, thank you, everyone. And before I wrap up, I'd really like to thank the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre and its staff, Jacinta Thompson, Renee Jolly, Cara Zanotti, and also for installing the exhibition, the wonderful Julian Tremaine, for enabling us to have this discussion and exhibition and really get the community involved with the conversation we're having. I'd also like to thank UniSA Creative, my fellow speakers, Dr Louise Bird and Dr James Curry, and also Architecture Museum and UniSA Creative staff, in particular Dr Susan Avey, Dr Susan Lustry, Hazel Ryder and Tim Reeves, as well as Chris Burns. So thank you very much for coming along, and I'd like you to thank the speakers too. both here. I think she just...
Thank you, Julie, Louise and James. Thank you for your wonderful insights and research. I found that absolutely fascinating, and I think for many of us, those beautiful memories, I mean, I've got some great memories of going shopping with Nana, and, you know, it was also about dressing up. Nana wore a little hat and gloves, and it was a wonderful experience. It was a very special experience. So thank you for taking us all on a really beautiful journey. So thanks very much. A reminder that the exhibition, Gone Shopping, Department Stores in South Australia, is on display in the Kerry Packer Civic Gallery until the 31st of May. So please, and also as part of South Australia's History Festival, so please come along and have a look. Bring your friends, family, share those memories. And thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again at a Hawke Centre event. Thank you.